Welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Alexander Antukh is my guest. Alex is the CISO at Aboitiz Power, which is the Philippines' largest owner and operator of renewable energy. Alex has extensive cybersecurity experience working not only in the Asia Pacific region, but also in EMEA. Alex is an advocate of cyber risk quantification, and that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. This is definitely not an area that I've spent a lot of time in, so I know I expect to learn a bit from our conversation, and I'm sure that you, the listener, will as well. So let's get today's episode going and bring in Alex. How are you, Alex? Thanks for making the time. I've been looking forward to this one.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Tell the listeners a little bit about your background. I know your background is pretty technical, but I always enjoy hearing about people's career paths. I mean, how did you end up in such a strategic role?
Well, yeah, I mean, my background is a bit non-linear, I would say. So I started as a malware analyst. It was 15 years ago already. And yeah, to be honest, I loved my profession back then. But at some point, I realized that malware was only part of how attackers compromise organizations. And I just wanted to learn more about other ways. So I thought, okay, there are other types of attacks, like through the web applications, through networks, and so on. And this is how I transitioned into penetration testing. And with time, a question came about on how to defend against application vulnerabilities at first, and then how to incorporate an AppSec program into the overall cybersecurity program. So I guess moving towards higher levels of abstraction for me was driven by the desire to understand better the connection between the practice and how it contributes to the overall security, while again still having the chance to apply previously gained experience. So that's more or less
Right.
how I ended up here.
I mean, I know that a lot of folks in the CISO chair don't necessarily have technical backgrounds, but from your point of view, do you see that as an advantage, kind of having those technical capabilities and bringing them to your role today?
Well, I mean, I'm obviously biased, but if you ask me, I think they help quite a lot. Well, at least to me, it helps to speak the same language with my team, mentor them
Right.
sometimes, being able to zoom in into specific areas as necessary. And I think it helps me to make more informed decisions. But I need to recognize that the more abstract the job becomes, the bigger role other skills start to play, like the soft skills like systemic perspective, withholding judgment, and soft skills in general, I would say.
I just have a question about, cybersecurity in the region. I think you're the first guest I've had from the who's working for a company in the Asia Pacific region, and I know you've got experience in EMEA in the past. I'm wondering if you can compare and contrast, for example, threats from both regions, how they're prioritized, how you guys approach them, and maybe the same question from the defensive side. How do the defensive approaches differ or are similar in both regions?
And glad that we opened the APAC region here. So thanks for having me again. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, I guess we could indeed split it into two. For the attacks and threats in general, I had to check a couple of reports actually before the podcast. I will be referring to Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report from 2024. So what I can say is that the threat landscape, even though it's shared worldwide, is quite different, and we need to consider major regional threat actors, geopolitical situation, and sometimes even potentially cultural differences. So what statistically is known is that EMEA suffered more than 4 times incident in the past year than the APAC region, and internal actors played significant roles in facilitating the breaches. Also, the main motivation in EMEA is usually financial, and compromised data is personal. For APAC, it looks a bit differently. So the threat actors are almost exclusively external, and 1 in 4 motives identified as espionage, with the most often compromised data as credentials. So I checked also for Americas a bit, but it's very similar in nature to EMEA, but even higher frequency of incidents, which is roughly twice of that. But now, of course, a more interesting question to me as a CISO is about the defensive side. Okay, we know that the
Sure.
regions differ from the threat perspective. So yeah, I would say that and this is now a bit more subjective than the actual data from the report. In my view, EMEA region has generally more established security practices, and there are a couple of quite widespread and uniform frameworks. So we have GDPR, the regulation, we have NIS2 directive now, and I think that generally there is tendency for more conservative approach to cybersecurity, focusing on comprehensive risk management and compliance. What I noticed that in APAC, there are definitely a few regional leaders, but in general, application of security is, in my view, less uniform. Investments levels also vary, but there is definitely a trend towards strengthening regulations and the overall posture. But I also must say that I see that APAC is undergoing rapid digital transformation, and I'd say that the cybersecurity market here is more dynamic. So it's kind of not just that EMEA is more established, but also there, in my opinion, there are quite a lot of opportunities here in APAC.
How would you assess in terms of either resources or the regulatory landscape? Is how does that impact maturity in your region versus EMEA, for example?
Yeah, so I think that definitely contributes. So, yeah, what I was referring to, the already established frameworks, I
Mm.
think that in general in EMEA, whenever a breach happens, it brings a lot of attention, and both the regulators and the public start to be much more aware of that. And again, it does happen in a few countries in the region, like we see that happening in Singapore. There is a lot of effort, a great effort being done by Australia. We see that Thailand now is very strong in that regard, and the countries are generally catching up here in the sense, but I think the lack of one standard that would apply to the whole region makes it difficult to speak of it as the region, because in fact we are talking about different countries and practices which are sometimes reflected one to another.
All right, so let's get into the main topic of our discussion, which is CRQ, the cyber risk quantification. I know we can spend some time talking about how it applies in OT environments, but I'm just curious, maybe as a kind of a table setter, how do you define CRQ? I know that this has kind of been of a passion project for you of late, so I'm curious to hear
Right.
your definition of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't like to overcomplicate that. Let's just say that CRQ is the process of calculating risk exposure and its impact on the organization. Let's just say that we talk about business relevant terms, potential financial impact, and the way how we calculate the risk. Let's just start here.
Do you have a sense for um, I, I, I mean, I wouldn't expect an exact number, but a percentage of companies that have adopted this approach? I know, for example, World Economic Forum, other bodies have endorsed it, have talked about it a bit. What's your experience in that respect?
Right. Yeah, I think worldwide it was based on Fortune 1000. I think it was roughly 32%, if I'm not mistaken. I do not have the exact number now, but I think it was more or less that number.
And is that about what you'd expect, or
Well, I mean, as a practitioner of risk quantification, I would hope to see close to 100% someday. So, no, I would say that I would hope that would grow. But at the same time, it started not so long ago as the established practice. So, I think the most important is the actual direction it's going.
in terms of applying it? And is this kind of like the main tool to calculate ROI, for example, of cyber initiatives? And do you use it in terms of strategy development or budget justification? Just tell me about kind of the applicability of CRQ and your
Oh, yes,
experience
definitely.
around it.
Well, I mean, let's again start to develop a bit on the definition. So we said it's a process of calculating risk exposure and financial impact to business in business relevant terms. So if we are to expand on what it means, at least for us, so we first of all start to speak the language that everybody in the world understands. We speak the language of dollar values. We do not need to speak the language of matrices, of some numbers that have nothing to do with the actual investment and so on. So that's like the basis here. But then there are benefits that are associated with the fact that we have that language of dollar values. So you're right that we are able to calculate and articulate ROI of the proposed initiatives, but it's based on our understanding of the financial impact of the cyber risk in our context. So we have a few. well, 10 specifically, but we plan to extend it, risk scenarios that we build for specifically for our context. And then by quantification, we can understand what are the ranges of the possible and likely financial impact there. Having that, we also can prioritize our risks accordingly, both the risk treatment and the remediation strategies, and we can justify the budget and future investment here. So it's really, I think we would need to think about it as the tool to make better decisions in terms of our risks and in terms of how to move forward with those.
ROI for cybersecurity has always been very difficult for CISOs to kind of uh, demonstrate. Why is this the right approach in your opinion?
Well, I mean, we can look at how it's happening in other parts of the organization and how ROI is calculated in general. It is true that sometimes it's not very precise thing, but it's enough if it's accurate, which I think a bit later in our discussion I will mention again these terms and I will elaborate a bit. So the way how we do that, and I believe this is the best practice so far, is that again, once we understand what contributes to the calculation of the risk, and again, at least in the terms of how we do that, there are the number of sources. Like we look at the external and internal threat intelligence, we have the telemetry from our own systems, we have the GRC questionnaire, and we understand our posture and so on. So once we understand which factors contribute to specific risk and risk scenario, then we can also understand that if we tweak those factors, such as we tweak our posture, the so-called what if scenario, we are able to see that, okay, if I can change this specific control by investing, let's say, 100K, but the calculation of the risk indicates that the likely losses would shift by, let's say, 2 million, obviously you have a very good ROI here, like more than 2000%, in fact, potentially. So that's the way how we take that. Again, we need to re-verify ourselves, and it means that we cannot just onboard a tool or just tell the consultants, okay, you calculate the risk for us and we are done. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I think that it's great that again it's being developed in the manner that will help us to understand, because if we do not have that, it makes it even more complicated, isn't it?
Is the output a tool for you as the CISO to use, or is it something that you can bring to the board or executives? Because part of me when I hear risk, it's the probability of being breached or the probability of a vulnerability being exploited. Um, but it sounds like it's a bit beyond that in terms of
Oh,
what you're
definitely.
explaining.
Definitely, and this is the beauty of it. So we generally see cyber risk as part of the overall risk program, the so-called ERM. And we noticed that different teams really assess their risk in different terms. So if you're a business executive who needs to make a decision, it's really hard to do so and make sense which risk is higher and needs attention. So I can give you one anecdote here. Um,
Sure.
there was one executive who believed that the impact of an operational disruption due to a specific system change was 4 out of 5, based on the scale, on some scale. So there is a matrix, there is likelihood and impact, and the impact was believed to be 4. So it sounds like a pretty high one, right? And initially it was taken. Then, when our team during quantification came back and said they started to challenge that, we noticed that this very disruption of a specific system was estimated, again, by a certain factor, by a certain criterion, uh, to be of higher impact than a full blown ransomware incident that, based on the very same matrix, was 3 out of 5. So we requested a financial analysis. We demonstrated how we calculated that, and we wanted to see what they did that and why they did what they did. And once the financial analysis was done, it became apparent that the actual impact for that system outage wouldn't even reach 2 out of 5. But the problem was that, again, if it's on the teams, if we kind of do not compare apples to apples, then it's very easy to say, okay, I have 4, you have 3, I'm more important. Let us just, go for it. So that's one thing. But then imagine that, again, we have a few risks. Let's say we have 5 risks that are 4, all of them. Yet, what do you do with that? So, how do you make sense of which risks are more important within the same category? And then finally, if you are to apply good risk management practices, then probably you have something like risk tolerance. So you have some threshold, and you say, okay, if there is a risk that is above $1 million, for example, and it's material,
Hmm.
that then we need to manage it. But how do you know if the risk is likely to fall above that number if you do not quantify? So you see all of those questions about how to make a decision about whether it is acceptable or not, and again, investments that I already mentioned for cybersecurity, but it's in general also for risk management. What is enough to mitigate this risk, to reduce it to the acceptable level? And again, how do we know whether it's acceptable or not? All of these are quite complex questions, and I believe that CRQ helps us to simplify that a bit in the sense of how to make those decisions.
And is the ultimate quantification always in financial terms, for example? And if so, are there risks to just staying on that one approach, on that one road?
So when we talk about the risk, so yes, okay, first answering your question, yes, that's the idea that we would be able to quantify. There are other models which give you some number, but again, if this is not related to the real world investments and dollar values, at least to me, it's not real quantification. So imagine that instead of saying that it's red and yellow, you say it's 1 to 10. I mean, yes, these are numbers, but they do not fulfill the role that they should in the quantified model. So that's why, to me, it's kind of at best semi-quantified with semi-quantified, which again is not something that we would be looking for. But speaking of the risks, I would say there are risks, of course, but so the qualitative approach has those risks as well. So I like to think of quantification more as an improvement to reduce subjectivity and being upfront about the assumptions of why we estimate what we estimate. So I spoke to the founders of the FAIR model. FAIR, I think it's the most famous quantification model currently. It's factor analysis for information risk. And I really like how they put it. They pretty much say that quantification helps to take the religion out of risk related discussions. So, again, it's not just because I am the expert and I said that this risk is high, you must believe me, and then we need to prioritize this as the company. Rather, it's okay, here are the assumptions why I believe what I believe. Here are five different sources. Here is the group of calibrated experts. And here is our outcome. But you do not need to believe us. You can challenge any of the assumptions. You know that the model is sound, and then you have this outcome, which again is not just one number, but a range of numbers.
Sure.
So it's kind of the best what we can produce in a way that is transparent and can and should be challenged. This is why I like it so much.
You brought up qualitative versus quantitative. Maybe a compare and contrast between the two, and why do you prefer quantitative over qualitative?
Sure, definitely. Again, let's think about it in terms of improvement over of quantitative over the qualitative method. So sometimes I hear the objection, and I think all of the practitioners of CRQ hear that sometimes the data is not enough. That how would you make a decision, and how would you quantify if you know so little? The standard response here, of course, is okay. So how tell me how you normally do that for qualitative, and let's see whether the very same data can be used for quantitative. And in fact, this is the another thing that I already briefly mentioned, but I would like to expand here, is that we are looking after accuracy here and not the precision. And again, let me give you one example from the calibration exercises, these which are normal before we even start the quantification. So whenever we talk about that, the ideal approach is not just to have enough data, but also to have a group of experts, ideally a few, and ideally even from different teams, who are calibrated, which means that they are able to provide correct estimates, even if they do not necessarily know much about the topic. So, uh, the classic example would be, imagine that I'm asking you, what would be your estimate, min and max range of years, when you think the Polish constitution was adopted? right? And again, I don't know
Hmm.
how much you know on the matter. Maybe you're a history geek and maybe you know everything about Polish history, or maybe you do not know, which is also fine. So if you know nothing about it, you may give a range of the past 1,000 years, and that would be a good range, right? I mean, maybe I cannot make too many decisions on that, and maybe it doesn't tell me too much because I mean, past 1,000 years is a lot, but it's a start. And now maybe you know that the first constitution in the world was ratified in the US in 1788. I mean, some claim it was San Marino in 1600, but let's say it's the US 1788. So you already have a better lower boundary, a more accurate lower boundary. And now
Hmm.
maybe you also know that the Polish constitution is called the first constitution in Europe. So you can guess that probably wasn't adopted too long after the American one. So you could say that maybe it's 1788 as the lower boundary, and maybe you would add, I don't know, 50 years, let's say, to as the upper boundary, and you have your range. So that range, first of all, is much better than 1,000 years, and it's much better than anything what is not so-called quantified in the relevant terms. But also, it um, if you look at it from the perspective of the ranges, we didn't try to narrow it down to 5 years, for example, or we didn't try to guess just one number. What we tried to do is to have a range which will contain the correct answer. So this is the difference. The precision is the width of the range. So if we say that we want to have just 5 years uh, of the width, we would say this is precision. But if we want to have 9 out of 10 ranges that are correct, regardless of how wide they are, this is accuracy. So we are looking after accuracy here, and the calibrated experts would be able to answer 10 questions like that, and in 9 out of 10 at least, they would be able to provide correct ranges. Again, even if they are
Hmm.
not experts in Polish history or cybersecurity for that matter. But once you know
Hmm.
how to do that, you precisely apply that to things like cybersecurity. So you might ask, what are the likely ranges and the likely losses for an average ransomware incident? And in fact, they are assessed and there are different reports. So, first of all, you have some data. But even if you don't, having that in mind and saying, it's not zero to, I don't know, $1 trillion, but let's say you say something like it's between 1 and 5 million, that gives you a lot of information already, and that's a very good start to kind of build your program, to start talking to your stakeholders, and to at least identify what would be the proper way of investment, even if you do not apply kind of full blown CRQ program. And even
Hmm.
if you do, then you continue improving that and narrowing those ranges to the appropriate level whenever you are ready to make that decision.
So it sounds like to me that qualitative risk assessments might be too subjective, maybe too subjective for your liking. Is that a fair statement to say? Are these too subjective to be entirely effective when it comes to cybersecurity?
So I would say that if qualitative risk assessments are done right, they could give you a good general idea about risk severity. Again, they need to be
Hmm.
enriched with all of that data and the assumptions and the transparency and the honesty of how you do that. But if you do that right, again, to me, they lack the fact that we are able to distinguish the alternatives and provide meaningful recommendations on how to act upon the risk. So they are not necessarily very bad. Again, I would look at them as the potential first step, but then ultimately the goal is to provide more value in terms of dollar values, ideally.
Hmm. I want to spend some time talking about CRQ in OT environments, for example. What's your sense for how often it's happening in OT environments? I know that I don't have to tell you how unique OT is in terms of proprietary technology and downtime and the intolerance for downtime, the availability requirements, the public safety concerns, all of it. Much different than IT environments. How does CRQ fit into OT, and what are some of the factors that go into deciding to do so if you do?
Definitely. And in fact, this is a very interesting question. So, in general, the difference between IT and OT, and then how CRQ is applied there. So, from my perspective, again, I would say that IT security in general is a more established and mature practice than the OT security. And I think that CRQ has been part of both is no exception here, in the sense that I think for IT security, you would find many more projects and many more initiatives than for OT. So I know of a few initiatives that already kind of bring quantification into OT, and I think it's generally entering the world of critical infrastructure, but it's not yet at the scale of non-OT environments. And there are, of
Hmm.
course, reasons for that. So again, we would need to account for IT OT interconnectedness, for custom protocols to be able to gather the data. Sometimes there are not enough integrations, and the maturity may be generally lower. But if we talk about the impacts, I think that again, it's we need to look at it from both sides. On one end, for OT, it is very common to calculate daily revenue and daily revenue losses and contractual obligations as the source of data for quantification. So we would say, hey, we have a plant there. We know that on a normal day we would produce, let's say, energy, and we would be able to sell that for, I don't know, let's say 100K. We know that if we do not provide that, and if we have a disruption after, let's say, 3 or 7 days, doesn't matter, then we also would need to pay a certain penalty. And it's very one to one. So it's quite easy to say that if there is ransomware, if there is some kind of operational disruption, and so on, and we expect it to last between, I don't know, 6 and 10 days, then the impact would be X, and we just multiply, and that's it. So in that regard, it's in a way easier than IT. Then, for example, estimate what's the cost of a data breach when personal data is leaked, right? But then there are other impacts which usually are not accounted for in IT, which make it even more challenging. So think about things like environmental impact, for example, or safety and human life. So if you think about that, strictly speaking, I think these impacts are quantifiable to the company because there are some insurance policies, there are some amounts of budget that are being dedicated to that, and so on. But then it's not really just about the money. I would say there are new ethical challenges even related to that. So I think that once the model progresses and starts to be more applicable to OT, these also need to be taken into consideration beyond, just the pure money that is being spent here. And I think in
Sure.
that sense, OT presents a, a more serious challenge than IT.
Hmm. But it is pretty interesting, though, that kind of I would imagine, like you mentioned, some of the inputs for your model uh, already exist for OT in terms of downtime, in terms of, we know we produce X amount of power that we can sell for X amount on a particular day. And if we're down, the
Right.
the calculation is there already. And that's may not necessarily be the case on the IT side.
That's right. I would say that the challenge here is that sometimes you talk to people who work for many years in OT, and they would say, hey, I work here for 20 years. I never saw a single cybersecurity breach. So, yes, it is true that if it happens, the impact is clear. But then what's the probability of that? And this is where the quantification again comes into play. So, somebody would say, hey, I didn't see it in 20 years happening, so I would be safe to assume that the next 20 years it would not happen.
Hmm.
Or we could say, yes, we used to have the so-called air gap, which means that the plants are not connected to any IT systems and they are kind of isolated, which means that the attackers are not able to penetrate, which of course we know it's not true. First of
Sure.
all, the pure air gap, it's rather a utopia. And then second, that even if it were, then still there are ways how the attackers can penetrate. So whenever we hear that, we need to have good arguments and good reasons to communicate and to discuss this with the senior stakeholders. And again, coming back, I think that having all of those sources of information that we normally are not talking about. Again, I mentioned external threat intelligence, like you would check it on Shodan and Spam House and others. You would have integrations with your own systems, like again, potentially you would use a CTD, or maybe you would use, I don't know before and others. Having good assessments and so on would precisely show that there are certain paths on the kill chain that the attackers might exploit and actually get to the worst case scenario. So yes, I would say that for OT, the impact part indeed is a bit more clear than for IT, but the path part, the likelihood part, is something that's posing the challenge.
And how does CRQ fit in with converged IT OT environments where you know using IT tools to measure uh, or to monitor OT events, et cetera? Um, is that a complication? Is that a challenge? How do you view that?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, I think it's a challenge even beyond CRQ in the sense that we need, as practitioners, to account for all of that interconnectedness. So it's easy to say, hey, we have OT here, IT here, everything isolated, and we're secure. But once we start to go into details, all of a sudden there might be an extra connection, or maybe configuration is not ideal, or maybe something was changed if we are talking about change management. Maybe there is secure remote access, which is not necessarily very secure, or maybe there are vendors who are able to connect and manage some of the systems, which means that in order for us to really estimate the likelihood and being able to map all of those scenarios, we need to have very good visibility into our
Mm-hmm.
networks and good understanding of whether the architecture that is put on paper matches the reality. And sometimes it's not the case. And I think it's not the case for probably all of the organizations out there because of that
Right.
sheer number and complexity. So, yes, I would say that it adds up to the component of confidence. Because again, whenever we are coming up with the estimate, we also provide the confidence. Like if we were to talk about again the example of Polish constitution, I would say, hey, I give you this range and it's wide enough, so I'm not very certain about what I'm saying, but I think that it's within the past 200 years, for example. But
Mm-hmm.
because I do not know much, I also cannot say that I'm highly confident in that unless I'm calibrated to provide you as wide interval as possible. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's reduce the interval, but at the same time reduce the confidence in what we believe. And coming back to OT here, if we do not have very good asset inventory and asset management processes, if we are not certain about our change management processes, if we do not have very good visibility into all our sites and so on, we can produce some estimates. Again, we could do that the same way for qualitative assessments, but we could do then with quantitative. But then we need to be aware of these limitations and be transparent about the confidence levels here.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine visibility, asset inventory. Those are all foundational for any CRQ endeavor. Correct. I mean, otherwise you're not going to get a full understanding of what you're trying to assess.
Yep, that's right.
Is there a role here for uh, cyber insurance? I guess what I'm asking is why not let the insurance brokers do the risk calculus if you pay for cyber insurance? Is it a
Right.
completely different paradigm?
I mean, I wouldn't say they're completely different, but I think the roles here are a bit different. So first, if we think about cyber insurance, like externally, I think in general, it's very hard for somebody external to have a 360 insight into the infrastructure in the sense that they might, of course, go and conduct a certain audit. They may request some evidence. They may ask for questionnaires and so on. But then the access to internal telemetry and having all of those sources of data that CRQ tools provide, it's hard to match, in my opinion. But then, second, imagine that they are right, and imagine that they did quantify everything well, and we have an
Mm-hmm.
accurate representation of our risks. So, the role of cyber insurance here is to really calculate the premiums, right? And they would say, okay, we cover you for that amount, and we know how to insure ourselves if the breach happens. So, we know how to calculate how much you should pay. Whereas for the organizations, in my view, it's one of the options, the risk transfer, I mean. So if we know what is our exposure, if we know what we can do and what other options are, such as, okay, I invest in certain project and I have this reduction of risk, or I invest in insurance and then I reduce or transfer that amount of risk. So to me, it's kind of one of the many of the options that the decision maker can make, which again I think that it's really just those angles that we need to consider. And of course, the fact that even if we do transfer the risk, not everything will be covered. So again, if we
Right.
know that value at risk is 300 million and cyber insurance is covering 30, well, the rest is still on us. So the
Hmm.
question
Right.
here is whether it's the best ROI to pay cyber insurance for this specific type of risk, or to invest in something else and kind of self-insure.
Hmm. I probably should have asked this earlier, but are there areas where CRQ makes more sense internally than others? For example, I'm thinking third party risk management, supply chain risk,
Right.
incident response planning. Just where is it best applicable?
Absolutely. And yes, so usually when we talk about CRQ, it tries to cover the whole program. But I definitely agree with you that there are some areas that, in my view, are weaker than others in terms of the actual management, and supply chain risk is a great example. So I heard more times than I'd like to hear about how certain tools on the market allow monitoring of their parties in terms of their external security posture, and then they assign custom risk scores. Uh, Again, the custom risk score could be ABC, or maybe it's some number, 1 to 100, or something else. The problem that I see here is that, okay, so you have the score, but what about the actions here, especially on the side of the customer, on our side? So imagine that you have 1,000 third parties, right? So you add them to the tool, you know the scores, you can list the most critical or vulnerable ones there, and potentially maybe you can even contact the vendors and request them to improve certain aspects of their external posture. Good luck with that, by the way. But so even if you go as far as to make internal owners of the risky vendors acknowledge and reconsider the contract for the future, it's also no guarantee that it will happen given the business context, right? But the problem that I see here is that if you ask the question, why we do all of that in general, when we talk about supply chain risk management, why we do all of that? So to me, the answer is pretty clear. We want to minimize the impact of a possible third party breach, right? It's really as simple as that. We have dependencies, they are breached, and we want to minimize the impact on us. But if you notice everything what I said so far, we haven't mentioned the word impact before. We were talking about the
Right.
likelihood of a breach based on the limited set of publicly available data. So what's missing here then, in my view, again, is that analysis on the customer side of which integrations and dependencies are the most critical, what are the impacts of the related process disruption, and how to minimize it should this event ever occur. So now, from this moment, we are talking about the more practical way of managing the risk. And this is precisely where CRQ can bring a lot of value. Not just, again,
Hmm.
the external data and the likelihood, but the actual impacts on our side and what we do about that.
Maybe it's my own lack of experience, but I'll ask it anyway. How would CRQ help minimize a CrowdStrike type of outage? Is there an applicability there to that kind of event?
Wow, that's that's a very good question, I must say. I would say that if the analysis is done correctly, and by the way, it's not a very easy thing to do because
Sure.
yes, CrowdStrike is very much integrated, and we saw that a mistake there could lead to pretty much impact on all of the Windows laptops and potentially other systems. So the analysis would be that, okay, what is we would need to assess first of all the what does it mean to have Windows laptops out. Then would build the model, would elaborate the model on what it means to have them down for, let's say, 3 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, and so on. So this way we estimate the impact. And then again, what are the options that we have that we control? Again, not the external posture and the likelihood, but the options on our side of what to do should this happen, such as maybe we have, I don't know, redundant systems. Maybe we have some laptops that are not Windows, which is the case for many executives, for example. Maybe
Right.
if one system is not available, and especially it's a critical system, we would account for I don't know, potential workarounds. For in the OT world, that could be manual. In the IT world, potentially that could be done through other scripts, or maybe again there is even a second system that is available there if it's a really critical function. So I would say that in that sense, both for third-party risk management and specifically for that scenario, that would be a work done together by the cybersecurity teams and the BCM teams. Uh, and yeah, I would say it would really help us to better prepare in terms of the actual response and recovery.
All right, Alex. So I'm just have one more question, one more kind of thought I want to go through with you before we wrap up. And I really appreciate again the time. And this has been, I know we've only scratched the surface of this, but it's been a really fascinating conversation. Just if you had any advice for an organization that wants to begin this journey of CRQ, what should be in place foundationally? What should they understand about, the models to use, whether it's FAIR or another? Just kind of, maybe 1, 2, 3 tips you might have for someone really wanting to get going on this kind of journey.
Right. Well, I think to me it's about the mindset, really. So I said it already, but I would like to actually repeat here. To me, CRQ is a method which aim is to improve the current way of doing security and doing risk management. It's definitely not a silver bullet. It will not work by itself. You would need people who understand what it is. You would need people who understand how to work with that, how to present the results, what are the limitations, that thing about confidence I mentioned, and so on. But if applied correctly, and I think it's in a way like science in general, it would allow you to gradually get better in the sense that, okay, you have some assumption, then some of those are challenged and changed, and some of them are really good. And then as you go, you start to know more about yourself, about your systems, as well as about the threat landscape that is also evolving. And with that, again, you gradually get better and you provide valuable information that in itself, and this is also important, that in itself will help make better decisions and thus reduce the risk.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I would say those things that it's important to remember. Again, not focus too much on a specific tool or, in general about some specific steps that you may follow from a vendor, but rather remember why you do so, and remember that again, it's really the people who are there who make the difference, not just the tool and the process.
All right, Alex, that's a good place to leave it for today. And I really think we should do another one of these down the road because, like I said, I think we only scratched the surface here today. But I want to thank you for giving me the time and sharing all this information. It was great stuff. I really appreciate it.
There, thank you very much, Mike. It was a pleasure.
All righty, have a great day. Thank you.